What is your freedom worth to you? Each of our guests had a light bulb moment. They longed to live rather than merely exist. They smashed through their fears and programmed minds, trusting themselves, their faith, and their survival instincts, leaving the guilt, fear, oppression, and drudgery of their past for a brighter future. They took a brave and courageous step into freedom. This is their story of how they got a life. Welcome to Get a Life podcast, X-Cult Conversations. You matter, and so does your story.
Coming up in this episode with Beverly Richardson.
For an only child who was extremely sociable, it was horrible. I couldn't play with the neighbourhood kids anymore. I will never forget how I felt. I felt dirty and unclean. This was about my beloved father who I idolised. It was two middle-aged guys who took me. Knowing what I know now, I would be horrified if that happened to my just-turned 13 granddaughter these days. I found out 11 years after she died that she was all packed to come and see me, but prevented. When they started to fill in the grave, I walked forward because I thought none of them were relatives, none of them. She had no relatives in the Ubis.
Yeah.
I walked forward and I think what got to me was that Hope had died. Male priests actually interview young girls. Like she said,
100%, yeah.
that is just, there's so much that's so wrong.
And it's still happening. It's still happening.
And they started going, there's the bastards, because that's what they used to call each other. That was a JT Junior thing. My cousin went to yell back at them and I went, no, don't join them. And I actually put my hands over my daughter's ears and said, would you mind not swearing in front of my daughter? She's not used to it. Like even giving wine to babies, she said, that's totally illegal. She said, you can report them to child services.
Yeah.
It's about getting everybody up, exposing this for what it is, to be able to give those inside the promise of a choice.
I believe God creates strong women for a reason.
When we feel for each other, then we don't do the shit that's happening.
I look at that with my mum's will being changed after a stroke and about 2 months before she died. I can imagine the stuff that they said to her that, you know, she's not going to go to heaven unless she does this. And
Yeah.
I would have loved to have seen the will before because they said we tried to get her to sell her house and she wouldn't. So to me, she always cared about me and she really wanted me to have stuff.
Hi, everyone. Before we start this podcast, I wanted to just insert some advice to the insiders that are trying to leave right now. Due to recent events, it's super important that we go through to you what these priests cannot legally do to you. So first of all, they cannot legally ask to take your phones and laptops and go through them and hold on to them and not give them back to you. Do not feel obligated to give them your phone. No matter how much fear they instill in you, that's your property. And the police themselves can't even seize or search your phone, laptops, computer, or even enter your home without a warrant. So definitely do not give the priest this power. And I understand that they do a lot of fear tactics, coercive control, spiritual abuse. We know that they are the worst bullies that you can come up against. But just know your right to hold on to your phone. Do not give it to them. Another thing that they're not allowed to do is they are not allowed you to block you in from leaving your own property. Those persons can be charged with a criminal offense of kidnapping or forcible confinement, depending on the circumstance of the alleged offense. And I also want you to know that when you are under the influence of coercive control and they're instilling fear into you so that they can detain you in this way, that is illegal. All of this is illegal. Another thing that they're not allowed to do is convince you to move away from your home, take you to another home you've never been in that's empty, hide your vehicle in a garage, lock the doors and tell you not to leave. And especially when they've taken your phone while doing this. This is absolutely illegal. You do not need to leave your home. And if you do want to leave your home, they can't confine you in there. They do not have the authority to move you somewhere, even if they tell you it's for your own good. They also cannot force you to resign from your job. Do not resign from your job if you don't want to leave your job. You have every right to be at your job that you've been in for all these years, and they can't force you to resign. No matter how much fear, they cannot force you to resign. They're going to use every fear tactic. They're going to use everything in the book, but just stand up to them and know your legal rights. If you have to call the police, call the police. That's what they're there for. We have to start making these bullies accountable for what they're doing. Another thing that we want you to know is they often pull out these things for you to sign, right? In all the heat of the moment, they're going to use your children against you. They use loved ones against you. They are going to try and get you to sign NDAs, whatever pieces of paper that they pull out. You don't need to sign them. And most of the time, these NDAs and papers are completely not even legally binding. So don't get coerced into thinking that they have more power over you. You are the one in control. You are the one in power. Do not let these bullies win anymore. Go to the police. If you start feeling the fear building and you know that you're going to start losing the courage and strength that you've had built, that is your cue to call the police. They are wearing you down to the point where they know that they can control everything that you're doing. Don't lose the courage and strength that you have taken so long to build by a bunch of bullies. Go to the police. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Get a Life podcast, X-Cult Conversations. Today on our panel, Cassie is joining us. Welcome, Cassie.
Hi,
and
everyone.
a very special guest, Beverly Richardson from Australia. Welcome, Beverly. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story with us. We all know you. You are very avid on Facebook with your comments and all your contributions. So many people will recognize your name. So I'm sure everybody is going to be excited to hear your story. I am going to just hand it right over to you. You can introduce yourself and start off and tell us your journey while in the Exclusive Brethren, because I know that it was Exclusive Brethren back in your day, and let us know how things unfolded for you. So go ahead.
Thank you, Cheryl. And I appreciate the Get a Life podcasts and hope something comes out of it all. Sometimes I've sat and watched things that I've thought things were going to happen and they haven't over the past. But I think with the internet these days that there's a lot more stuff worldwide and starting to realise everybody's story is pretty much the same. So that should have an impact, I believe. Now, a brief background. I probably wasn't a typical EB in the fact that my parents were both first generation EBs rather than it going back a long time. My father's mother was an EB, but his father wasn't, and my dad only joined in his 20s. My mother joined when she was 7. Before that, they'd been open brethren, but they moved to Orange, which is sort of west of Sydney, actually where BDH's mother family lived, so they used to come up on holidays quite a bit. They moved there and I don't think there was any open brethren, and they joined because at that stage it wasn't that different apart from I think the baptisms. They used to have baby baptisms rather than believers' baptisms as such. But both my parents were good Christians, but I think had strong Christian values. Dad was probably a bit more by the seat of his pants. He was a country boy and he always believed in helping people and things like that. My mum had been brought up during the Depression. Her father used to take people, tramps and things in to their house and give them meals and often a bed for the night, even though his wife used to worry about it. And he was very much a helper. He worked 3 days a week so someone else could work 2 days a week, and he was very giving. So they both had really strong values that in the long run they taught me, but in the long run they didn't marry up with what was happening in the Exclusive Brethren. So in one way it was probably to their detriment. Because of the other thing that is quite unusual in my life was I was an only child, which is fairly rare in the EBs.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah, but Mum had had a lot of miscarriages before me, and it was about 7 years, and I think she virtually had the whole 9 months in bed with me. So I was a very wanted child, and being the only girl in a family, too, I never felt the misogyny, at least while my father was still alive. I never felt second rate, so it probably wasn't normal. I also had a pretty good life up until the whole separation edict, which is what I want to talk about, because I feel a lot of people wouldn't know what life was like in the EBs before separation. But I've just briefly started going over my story. And on both sides, I had an aunt and an uncle who never joined the EBs. My father's family in my local town and my mother's family were based in Sydney. It was a strong family unit, and I had many cousins on both sides, and I spent a lot of time with. And being an only child, that was fairly important to me, that I actually grew up with other kids. There was one family lived in the same street as me, like 2 blocks away, but they weren't EBs, and so I often went to their place and played. I also played with the neighbourhood kids. We had a really strong neighbourhood back in those days. They came to my birthday parties. We held a cracker night once a year at my place. My parents always went overboard. My dad bought lots of crackers, and we spent all day building a bonfire because we had another house block up the back of our yard. Dad always made me things that I could share with the other kids. Like I remember one year I got a swing which he'd welded. Another year he sewed a tent on my mother's sewing machine. And so the kids came to our place. I was always into drama, so we put on lots of plays, and the parents would come and watch. And we'd, put up curtains. And so I was always the organiser in all this and had lots of fancy dress stuff. And so that's what life was like. And I played with my friends at school and sometimes visited their houses too. And our mums met in the park so we could play on the playground. My mum played social tennis over the back fence and had lots of cuppers with the neighbours. She always took soup to anyone who was sick, and especially the Baptist lady next door if she was feeling poorly. And that was how life was, and life was pretty good. Christmas was great. Christmas Eve, we went to my non-EB uncle's place and exchanged presents with the wider family. Christmas Day, we went to Granddad's place, that's my father's father, who wasn't an EB, for Christmas dinner with my EB cousins. My unmarried aunt and 2 unmarried great-aunts all lived there as well. They were all EBs, but Granddad never was. His late wife, who had died when I was a tiny baby, had been EB. The whole family blended quite nicely. We all knew we had different beliefs, but that was okay. We respected that. My mum wasn't too impressed that Granddad played competition billiards at the Railway Institute. She was a bit self-righteous, I reckon, but that was probably the only thing they ever said against him. And so life was pretty good. And then all of a sudden, we were too good for those non-EB relatives and friends. JD Jr. had said, you must not eat with non-EBs or really fraternise with them at all. I was about 7 or 8 and life changed dramatically. It was all to do with some scripture about silver and gold vessels and wooden and earthen vessels in 2 Timothy 2, and apparently we were the gold and silver vessels. Granddad, my dad's father, was relegated to the bedroom of his house. He was an old man who had been unable to work for years due to being knocked off his push bike by a car when my dad was a teenager. He had to eat his meals in his room. He was certainly not well enough to live alone. It certainly crushed him, and I wonder if it hastened his death. Granddad died on September 1961 when I had just turned 9 of a coronary occlusion. He was in hospital for a couple of weeks prior, but of course we were not allowed to visit. I think my dad may have visited him a couple of times. He had lived for his family, and he used to cook and make us stuff like little kid-sized chairs. Now we only saw one daughter and son and their families, but they could not visit him at his house. The EBs were happy to bury him. He was the last closed coffin we had before the new rules of open coffins, which was very unusual in Australia. So many things changed. We could eat lunches with our school friends. All of a sudden we can't. We're not meant to fraternise with them at all. For an only child who was extremely sociable, it was horrible. I couldn't play with the neighbourhood kids anymore. I used to watch all my former friends play through a hole in the fence. There were no EB kids living close by, and we were a one-car family. Dad took the car to work. He was a psych nurse and worked shift work, but his hours were 6:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. Life was so lonely for Mum and I. Mum had to stop her cuppers with the neighbours and playing tennis. She also struggled with not being able to take soup to ill neighbours, like the nice Baptist lady next door. Looking back, she suffered depression, probably from that point on, and would go to bed for a week at a time. She also didn't attend the meeting often, and our family was looked down on, as we certainly didn't fit the mould. Once a week, Mum met me at school, and we had afternoon tea in the park and visited the library. Prior to separation, we used to eat afternoon tea in a cafe, and I find that quite strange now when I think that they all eat in cafes again now. But of course we weren't allowed, so we bought a takeaway and had it in the park. The library was our secret. I devoured books. I read everywhere, and so did Mum. I virtually lived in a fantasy world of the books I loved, where kids had playmates and went on adventures. Mum and Dad did their best, and school holidays I often stayed over with my in-cousins or my aunt who lived across the road from a family with kids a bit younger than me. My maternal grandmother, I call her Nan through the story because that's what we did, came to live with us as her son had looked after her after a heart attack, but of course he wasn't in the brethren. She and my dad clashed a lot, usually about him not buying stuff like new carpet or something else. She liked to pay stuff off and Dad liked to save for things. Looking back, she wasn't happy and lost contact with her son and other daughter, plus her brother and sister and a lot of family. I remember them visiting a couple of times. They would drive from Sydney, a 4-hour drive, and have to see my Nan on the front veranda and not even be offered a cup of tea. They weren't allowed inside our house. No wonder that family all hate any form of religion. We certainly did not show them Jesus. At the end of 1964, Mum and Dad were withdrawn from, and that was a big change. I was in grade 6 and had just turned 12. Dad had been having a lot of priestly, so I was in my bedroom and could hear lots of loud voices, and it seemed to go on night after night. Dad had been withdrawn from, or maybe it was just shut up back when I was younger for a short while, and my mum had moved into my bedroom but not out of the house. So it must have been after the separation edict, and think it was for some sort of immoral thing, as they obviously thought he had done the same thing again. Some of it is a blur, but not the assembly meeting. I had just turned 12, and at the end of grade 6, it's a time when you're just becoming aware of your own sexuality. I say that to set the scene. It is so clear, like it was yesterday. They got me to sit in the front row and I felt really special. I didn't have a clue what was coming. Mum had burned her foot with hot dripping, getting a roast out of the oven, so was hobbling with a bandaged foot and no shoe. Next minute they say something like my father had touched the breasts of a woman he worked with. This was in front of everyone, all my peers, all my friends. I was mortified. Being in the front row, everyone stared at me. I will never forget how I felt. I felt dirty and unclean. This was about my beloved father who I idolised. I find this really true that they say stuff like that in front of young children. They won't let them have sex ed, and then they do stuff like this. And this still can bring tears to my eyes. And this was like, I'm now 71, so that's many, many years ago. Mum told me later it never actually happened, but some lady got in and put her hand on his knee and he got out of the car, and that was all. It was during the system and people were confessing to trite, trivial things, but they were sure he had done more, and after a week or more of them hounding him in Priestley's, he shouted at them, "Yes, I did it all." That I can believe, knowing my father. Mum was kicked out for being in subject as she is stuck up for Dad. Out they walked and were told the brethren would look after me, so they went home. Apparently they didn't expect to be withdrawn from either, so were in shock. Mum said she would have prepared me if she'd realised they were going to say all that. I didn't actually have a clue.
Oh my
The priest
gosh.
decided I would go to live with my Aunt Janet, so took me home to pack a bag and go live with Aunt Janet. It was two middle-aged guys who took me. Knowing what I know now, I would be horrified if that happened to my just-turned 13 granddaughter these days. Looking back, I wonder if I had chosen to leave too, I wonder if my parents would have ever come back. I lived with my aunt for the long school holidays, and then Mum insisted I went home, so it was about 6 weeks. Aunt Janet was very good to me. She was a single woman and had spent most of her life looking after sick people or old people. The brethren gave her such a hard time during the system about the cleanliness of her house. It was brought up in the meeting. Being an unmarried woman in the brethren was bottom of the pecking order. She had always looked after old people, so she certainly didn't have much of a life, and she died like in her 50s. During the time I didn't live at home, my nan was withdrawn from too. Can't think why. Maybe she refused to move out, or she told them what she thought and was therefore in subject too. I seem to come from a long line of in subject or strong women or self-opinionated ones, so I didn't fit the EB female very well at all.
Join the club, darling.
My next generation, I've got 3 daughters who are quite, yes, they speak their mind as well, and 5 granddaughters who are also strong personalities. I do family history and I often look back and it's the women that are the standout in their families, right back to even my convict heritage, which my mum never knew about. I'm very thankful for the parents I had and the values they instilled in me. As an only child with a very strong-minded mother, I did not feel the misogyny in my immediate family. My dad certainly did not treat Mum or me as second-rate.
Wow.
By the time I returned home, my nan was living with the Baptist lady next door, and my parents had done up Nan's old room for me. It was certainly weird going home at first, and I ate in the sunroom and my parents in the kitchen. Eventually, Mum would put the tablecloth on 2/3 of the table, and I had a placemat at the end. We just kept that to ourselves. First, I went to church meetings with a family who lived not far away with 8 children, but then another family who had a 3-month-old baby took me to church and made me very welcome. The mother was a relative of my father. They had 3 sons and the new baby who was about 3 months old. I loved going to church with them and used to be allowed to look after the baby in the meeting. I loved it. I really missed that little girl when I did leave the EBs because I had a strong bond with her. It was certainly a strange life. It was like I was living 2 lives. My brethren life on Sundays and weeknights, and I gravitated more to my non-EB school friends at school. I had no brethren kids in my grade, and at lunchtime we had to go to someone's house close to the high school. I was teased quite a bit, or it wasn't bullying, because I liked school, and that was fairly unusual in the EBs during that time. I did extremely well at school. I was doing top-level everything in Latin and French instead of cooking and sewing, which most of the brethren girls would have done. And I remember people saying it was such a waste for a girl. I also got bullied a bit by non-brethren kids, but never by the people in my own class. We had school cases in those days, and they would flick our cases open between lessons, so all our books fell out on the stairs with hundreds of students going up and down. And they used to call us feathery legs back in those days. My own classmates respected me and I respected them. I often felt I had a foot in both camps with my parents withdrawn from, and me not really fitting the EB model of a girl. Even my clothes didn't really fit the normal, and I made my own clothes, which were certainly not normal EB regalia. I was still a member of the library, so I used to pore over teen fashion magazines as well as read anything and everything. I am so thankful for being allowed to read all those years. I also had an English teacher who gave me a love for English literature and Shakespeare and the classics. I certainly had read Animal Farm and George Orwell's 1984 in high school, along with D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers, which we studied. He wrote Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was once a banned book, so I don't think the EBs would have gone along with that, and I don't even think my mother realised who he was. It was one of our school textbooks. In 1967, the system crashed, and then came the review. Mum and Dad were restored. It had all been an error.
What?
Yeah, it's a bit of a shock, isn't it?
Wow.
And that's why I feel I've got to tell that story. Like, that sort of stuff's lost. Otherwise, I've got a really good memory. And so I feel a lot of people my age don't have that sort of memory. Dad was popular at first and asked to preach, but they did question him not drinking whiskey, told him he was a prohibitionist. He just laughed in their face and said he'd always drunk beer. He just didn't like whiskey. I certainly was not encouraged to drink alcohol. Nan came back to live with us from next door as she was restored, having been wrongfully withdrawn from too. The only problem was during the time the three of them were out, the no pet rule had been introduced. Nan had a budgie named Pal that she loved, and it talked. By this stage, she was basically bedridden with heart problems. She couldn't even walk to the toilet. She wasn't allowed to even stay on her own. I often missed the meeting to stay with her when I had lots of homework. She just moved in, and next she had a long priestly about her bird. And after about 2 or 3 hours of yelling, out walked the priest with the bird in the cage. Nan would have known they were going to kill it or let it out. That was just plain cruel. Nan went to hospital soon after and never came out. She died on the 25th of July, 1967. That was the first time I really questioned them. The Jesus I knew would not have treated an old lady like that. He would have shown compassion. The trouble is, once you question one thing, the other things soon show up pretty quickly. I was 14 at this point. Meanwhile, the honeymoon phase didn't last long for Dad. Dad still worked as a psych nurse and on shift work, but by that stage he was in charge of a ward. He had every Sunday off, and his 2IC had every Saturday off to play golf. The brethren told Dad he had to have Saturday and Sunday off. Dad said no, that was not fair on his staff. They wanted him to leave and work for the brethren company. He refused, as he had hurt his back lifting a patient into an ambulance and was on workers' comp and help at work, which he wouldn't have got if he'd gone to work for a brethren company. Plus, looking back, I don't think he had a lot of respect for them. A lot of them. He had a lot of cousins in there who he liked, but a lot of them left over Aberdeen anyway. He told them if it was wrong to work weekends, we couldn't make others do so. So when they all came home from hospital at weekends, he would do something about it. I don't think they liked my dad very much because he was a bit mouthy too. He used to come out with a lot of logical things. They decided he had a defect and could go to meeting but not take part, preach or pray. They also didn't invite us for meals and we didn't invite them back. He was also in trouble once for going to Dubbo to tow one of his staff members, a single mother with 2 young kids, home. Trouble was he missed a meeting. My mother was okay with it as she thought it was Christians should help people, and that was how she had been brought up. But obviously the EBs seemed to think my dad was having an affair with the lady because, you don't go and help somebody who rings you up who's stuck at night with 2 little kids, and it was about an hour away. That, of course, made our family more second-rate in EB hierarchy. By then, I didn't care. One lot of holidays, when I was around 15 or 16, I made friends with some girls, EB girls from Sydney. I went to babysit their younger siblings during meetings, and I also visited them in school holidays. That sure opened my eyes a lot. Those Sydney EBs sure got up to heaps. I went to my first restaurant, saw my first movie, The Sound of Music, in 1967-68. During this time, I also rebelled and became much more friendly with my school friends and attended my first school dance at the end of grade 10. I had taken the hem of my dress up under the blankets with torchlight and also applied my makeup with torchlight. I waited until Mum and Dad went to bed and walked out the back door and down to the corner and rang a cab from the phone box. That was the start of my rebellious phase. I had such a great time. I went to 20 more school dances over the next 2 years. The Saturday night ones were hard when I'd gotten home late and had to get up for the supper at 6.
I bet.
Especially when I'd gone to bed so early.
Yeah.
They're pretty tough. You've got to laugh at those sort of days. I stayed on at school for grade 11 and 12, so was doing matriculation subjects those last 2 years. I also started attending scripture at school and attended a different religion every week and asked lots of questions of all the ministers. I joined the school debating team and I played sport, which was a no-no. Prior to this in high school, we were not allowed to play sport but had to go to maths detention with the naughty kids. I got away with it a lot because there were no other brethren doing matriculation, so they'd all finished at grade 10 because that was what the edict was at that time. I always loved drama, and in grade 12 we put on a play of St Trinian's Choir for a school fundraiser during the day, complete with naughty songs, which I'd got from one of my cousins from the university handbook. But they were so good. But we were so good, we were chosen for a night performance. And then, as I had organised it all, the others said I had to go. And thankfully, I had my driver's licence by then. So we walked out of the meeting and made sure we were on at the end of the concert. I really would have passed as a very rebellious girl. But really, I was just doing normal things.
Yeah.
There were certainly some funny stories looking back. When 3-day meetings were on, most kids had the Friday off school. Not me. I walked in my school uniform about 4 p.m, sat upstairs up the back, opened my school bag and did my homework. Or I used to have study notes on little cards that fit in my Bible. You could get a card-sized thing called key facts on classic literature or Shakespeare. So again, I zipped them into my Bible. I got lots of swatting done during the meetings.
That's incredible. That is incredible. I love it.
Otherwise, I used to read my Bible. I was really into reading about the women. I loved Deborah and Ruth and Esther. So I'd sit and read that rather than listen because it was so boring. My dad was in trouble for me doing those 2 extra years at school, but he said I was on a scholarship, so all my books and everything were paid for, so it was his business. I also went to Sydney on the school bus to watch our school footy team play in Sydney once. I had lied to my parents about what I was going to Sydney for. They thought it was an English studies thing at Sydney Uni. Well, it was near the uni anyway. I also had a worldly boyfriend for about 3 months until it all got too hard. He used to come to borrow a science textbook and I would take him home and we'd go parking. I remember the hair down rule came in about that time, and there must have been a slight gap from hair down to scarves, as I had my hair down for my cousin's wedding in April 1970 and wore a hat. I think scarves came in soon after. I remember trying to be very creative with the scarf rule, making scarves out of leftover dress fabric or wearing berets. I used to ask questions like, why did we stop wearing hats? And they'd say it was too ornate, or so I wore a beret to church. Not good enough. Do you want me to take it off? Do you have a scarf? No? Okay, leave it on. They're simple, though. I was a bit of a smart ass. I really wanted to go to uni and was certainly doing subjects that would prepare me well. I had applied to Sydney University to study economics and also for a Commonwealth scholarship, which would pay tuition and also some living expenses. I had really hoped that some way I could do it and my parents would support me to go, even though it was against EB teaching. In the August-September school holidays of 1970, I was invited to attend a special school on the Great Depression at New South Wales University for a week. Only 100 students from the whole of New South Wales were invited, and I was the only attendee from my hometown. It was a real feather in my cap. I stayed with my Sydney EB friends. Dad and Mum took me to Sydney and were coming to pick me up. This was all around the time of Aberdeen. I think I first heard about it when I was in Sydney. Unfortunately, my dad died of a massive heart attack at age 52 while I was in Sydney. My world turned upside down. He died on a Thursday, was buried on the Friday. I turned 18 on the Saturday, and it was Father's Day on the Sunday.
Oh, man.
Oh, man. That is awful.
My mum was a mess and I was angry. My dad had died with a defect. His workmates wanted to form a guard of honour in their uniform in the main street, and I okayed it. I think there were more non-EBs at his funeral than EBs, or at least at the graveside, who were the EBs that always looked down on him. The EB priests came to see Mum about the guard of honour. How worldly. And I said, don't berate her, speak to me. I said, my father, who in your eyes was defective, had more Christian testament in his little finger than they ever would, and the funeral certainly showed that. I had lost my champion, however. I got my entrance to uni and my scholarship, but didn't feel I could leave my mum. Dad died without a will. He had a bank account that Mum didn't know about. My non-EB uncle said that Dad had told him it was for my university education. Our finances were all tied up. As there was no will, I had to sell my car. Dad had made me out of 3, and the finances took about 6 months to sort out. Meanwhile, Mum wanted me to finish my exams, but I knew I needed to get a job. I finished my last exam on a Friday and started work as a doctor's receptionist on a Monday. All my non-EB friends were going off to Sydney, and I felt trapped. I decided I would have a last hurrah and go to my graduation dance. A school friend made me a long skirt, and another borrowed a nice blouse from her mother for me to wear. I was determined to go to one whole dance rather than just a small part. So I actually got my hair done on the way home from school, and when I got home, I told my mum I was going to the dance, and I just walked out and went round to another school friend's place around the corner and got dressed there. My mother came to the school gym, but I hid under the table, and my friends and teachers didn't give me away. Of course, I had to have a Priestley about it. By this time, someone had given me a puppy, which of course I wasn't meant to have, and I named her Sadie. Every time the priest raised his voice, she growled at him. The priest said, "That dog should not be inside." I cheekily replied, "That dog lives here, you don't." This was while I was on SWAT back for my exams. My poor little Sadie was put down at age 2.5 as soon as I left. The next 2 years are a bit of a blur. I was not happy. I felt trapped. I was pleased I didn't work for EBs. The whole Aberdeen thing blew up and JT Jr. died and Mr. Symington took over. I just wanted to leave. I certainly didn't want to marry and have kids in there, but how could I leave my mum? As an only child, she had no one. Her 2 siblings were out. One funny story during that time was we were stopped from going to the local swimming pool. I, of course, had to ask why, and they told me because you have to pay. I don't actually think that was the real reason, but that was what they told me. All of a sudden, we didn't have to pay, so I told Mum we could go swimming again. She said, "Don't you think we should check with one of the brothers?" I said, "No." So we went after church and took other kids, hauled over the coals yet again. I told them again it was my fault, not Mum's. They'd always said we couldn't go because we had to pay. I always think you go through a time where you have one foot in both camps, but it cannot stay that way. What can seem exciting at first, like sneaking out, becomes sordid and awful later. I have described it like a seesaw, unsure what they are called in other countries, but you cannot balance it equally for long. Eventually, one side is heavier. In January 1972, my mum and I were staying with my dad's cousins in Sydney, EB cousins, of course, and I met a guy who was the brother of their daughter-in-law who was on holidays as well. By then I was 19 and he was 18, and we hung together a bit because we were both on holidays. We went to the local pool and to the city on a tram with my mum. We went out for coffee after church with another couple of young people, and Mum was okay with that. She always thought there was safety in numbers. His family was divided, with his father in and his mother out. He was part of a large family, and some of his siblings were in and some out. He had left at 15. Actually, his mother had left when he was about 5, which I think totally affected the family, but that's his story and I won't tell his story. But it definitely, it was a big deal. He'd left at 15, gone back at 17, and I met him at 18. He certainly was not a typical EB guy. We wrote letters to each other, and I came to his home state of Tasmania, which is where I live now, for a visit. In the middle of the year, I was also friends with his sister, so I wasn't just visiting him. At that time, Hobart was known as being extra strict in the EBs. I had an EB dressmaker make me dresses, and I said to her, "Make them long enough for Hobart." My EB girlfriend, when I got to Hobart, said, "Didn't I have anything longer?" It was so hard to spend time together with this guy, and after a couple of days, I agreed to sneak out and meet him and his sister and another guy. I had promised Mum I would not go out with him on my own, so I insisted the others came too. I climbed out of a window to just drive around the city at night and park under the bridge. I mean, we weren't even allowed to speak outside church. People were like, it was really awful. And I being the rebellious person I was, I just was not happy about it. If they'd let us be normal, I wouldn't have sneaked out. Unfortunately, when we went, the other guy knocked something over and we were caught, and I was sent home in disgrace. Met in Melbourne and Sydney, except they didn't recognise me as an EB. I can remember being no scarf. I'd had my hair down at the hairdresser's before I went, big sunglasses, a midi overcoat and sand suede boots, so I didn't look pivotal. And I walked past these people in Melbourne about 3 times and eventually felt sorry for them and introduced myself, but they didn't think it all. It was quite funny. I often have chuckles about things too. I hadn't even been allowed to speak to my mum before I was sent home, so I didn't have a clue what they'd told her. It was actually quite a funny story because I didn't even know we'd been caught, because apparently they'd opened my door and looked in and thought I was still there because I'd put a dark green jumper on the pillow and just looped Doona over. So it looked like I was there. So the whole story was I'd planned it. I'd taken a wig down to put on my bed and all this sort of thing, of course. And they obviously thought we'd done the deed. I remember when I was having the Priestley, I went, with other people watching, really? Right.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it was hard that I was not allowed to speak to my mum until I went home because I didn't know what they'd told her. The guy was kicked out. I had a Priestley and I'm unsure of the other two even got a rap over the knuckles. My uncle insisted on being in on my Priestley and I'm forever grateful to him. He told them it was time they left and they were lucky my father was not still alive or he would have knocked their block off. I was cross I had wasted so much money, as air tickets back then were about 10 weeks' wages for me.
Wow.
That was my tipping point. From then on, I just wanted to leave and told this guy that I would leave early the next year. I wanted to give myself 6 months to put things in place. I certainly wanted to explore the relationship some more, and I also wanted to leave the EBs. I think people think that I left totally for him, but I had wanted to leave for quite a long time. So the next thing was setting things in place. I knew I had to leave so much behind, and I still felt so guilty about my mother. This trip was mid-year, and of course I was not allowed to keep contact, but I got a PO box and he rang me at work. I confided in another lady at work and I bought a new case I left in the back room at work. I had my winter clothes I wanted to take in it by October. I learnt my cousin, who had left once before, but it had stayed in the same town and got hounded so much she went back. She still wanted to leave. I ended up confiding in her too, and we prepared to leave together, which was, I think, a lot easier. She also got a case at my work, and one long break we threw shoes out her bedroom window into the garden and picked them up and put in my boot. There were some funny stories again, looking back at the things we did then. I used to take a basket to work and could fit one item of clothing in it each day. I also had a lot of my grandmother's photos, etc. I wanted to bring. We had 5 cases between us, one with winter clothes, one with summer clothes, and one case we shared with a set of sheets each, a pair of towels, and our photos. I had joined a health fund and got hold of all my paperwork, like my birth certificate and stuff. I used to post the mail at work, so for a few months I had been getting home about 6 p.m, even though I finished work at 5. I'd just been gradually getting later and later. My cousin had been doing the same thing. We had arranged accommodation with some OB nurses, that's Open Brethren nurses, in a share house in Hobart. We shared a room initially. We made sure our parents got notes we were safe. We left our work early, about 3 p.m. on a Friday, and got a ride to Sydney with 2 of my cousin's workmates. We were well on the way before they realised we would be missing, but were worried they would watch the flights to Tasmania at the airports, as would probably guess that's where we were going. But we managed to get to Sydney okay and then on to Melbourne. But on the Melbourne-Hobart leg, there was a young guy, was actually my ex's brother, who was 13 at the time, who recognised us but thankfully covered for us, because by then we were actually wearing pants and makeup, and because we'd bought ourselves one pair of jeans and one pair of other pants. Looking back, I can remember the irrational fear we had. Thankfully, we got to the share house and our housemates were lovely and very welcoming. But, yeah, when you look back, we were just doing normal things, but that irrational fear that you have that they're going to get you and drag you back, even at age 20.
Yeah.
I'm sure you all identify with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
They didn't waste any time withdrawing from us. We left on the Friday and were withdrawn from on the Tuesday night, not even shut up.
Wow.
The ground, apparently we were both sleeping with this guy, both of us.
Both.
Was
Both of
because
you?
they came him and he wouldn't tell them where we were living. So that was the grounds. I mean, he was living across the river and from us, but that's beside the point. I don't regret leaving for 1 minute, but I do regret hurting my mother. I wish I had been able to do it some other way. My mum had my little pup put down shortly after I left. I know she would not have done that willingly, as she loved that dog, and it would have been company for her. It still haunts me. It was so young. If only I could have taken her with me. A couple of years later, that guy and I married and had 3 beautiful daughters. I haven't told his story as it's not mine to tell. Looking back, I was probably pretty dependent on him, as I had no one else once my cousin returned to my hometown after a year. Maybe that stifled him somewhat. Also, I believe living with ongoing grief is hard. It is certainly extra pressure on relationships. We did last 40 years together, so I gave it a good shot. I look at our daughters and I can have no regrets. I look at our daughters and I'm so thankful they have had freedom to make choices for themselves, things that I didn't get to choose. After having left, we visited my hometown many times, and each time I tried to visit my mother. A few things stand out from that. The first visit, I came back after a year to get some of my possessions, and on going into my room, I found letters from me in a plastic bag stuffed behind the wardrobe. I never said anything as there were priests in the lounge room. So I knew that she kept my letters but hid them because she was scared someone would find them. If I ever told her I was coming, they shipped her out of town, so I was better to turn up unannounced. I used to have nightmares every time I returned to my hometown, often that they were going to take my kids and that they said I was an unfit mother, etc., as I wasn't an EB. Certainly a sign of PSD, I would think. I only have one photo of my kids with my mother, and that time we turned up unannounced and she was not dressed. And my youngest daughter, who was about 3 or 4, wandered in after her into the bedroom and must have seen photos of us under the glass in her dressing table as she was saying, "There's Mummy, and there's her sister's names and hers," but which made me realise that she did care. Being an only child, these were her only grandchildren. So not only were my kids cheated, were I and my kids cheated, but she was as well. People I have spoken to who knew her in and was a widow were unaware that I and my kids even existed. They never realised that she'd ever had children. I never doubted she loved me, but she thought she was sacrificing for me. I totally believe, no matter how misguided that is. When she talked to us at the front door, she was obviously always fearful someone would see her talking to us or our cars with Tasmanian number plates. The best chat I ever had with her was when I went by myself and parked around the corner, and I walked down her lane and she was in the back garden. She took me through the house and had a really good chat that time. At one stage, I lost her for 5 years. She was never at her home, but her neighbour said she was not allowed to sleep there, but she came home sometimes. I eventually tracked her down to where she was living and asked if we could visit. My ex and I had to sit in the garden so we wouldn't contaminate their house, and the children were allowed 5 minutes in the front hall. The 2 elder ones were adults by this stage. One of my daughters had actually had a year in Sydney at Bible College, this was her return trip to catch up with some of her friends, so she would have been 21. But I remember that my other daughter said that they asked what she was doing at uni, and because she was doing computer at that time, and that was when computers were really evil. So the lady of the house where Mum was staying overrode it and said she was doing commerce.
Oh.
One of my daughters remembers her looking out the door with tears running down her face. I couldn't even see her with the sun shining on the screen door. I found out 11 years after she died that she was all packed to come and see me, but prevented. A tradesman told one of my ex-EB friends in my hometown that he knew that she was packed up ready to come. So many questions I will never get answered. When was it? I suspect probably about the time she went missing for 5 years. How did they prevent her? Was it just coercive control? One day in 2006, I got the phone call I had been dreading. She had had a stroke and was not expected to survive for too long. I went up to visit and I had made her 2 small scrapbooks. The first one up until I left home, which included photos of her parents and her in her wedding photos and me as a baby. And the second from the point that I left, and included 2 of my kids' wedding photos and letters from them. I know one of them had actually written something and quoted Bible verses about mothers and grandmothers, Eunice from Timothy in the letter. So there was nothing that was harmful. But I found out later that they'd taken that second scrapbook off her. I was allowed to visit twice for 10 minutes over that time when I went up. 2 states I travelled. And, of course, it was both visits were chaperoned. I remember when I walked out the door the last time I saw her, the lady followed me to the front door and said, I hope you had a good look because you won't see her again.
Wow.
And I remember driving around the corner and just bursting into tears. I held my head high till I went. And luckily one of my school friends' parents, I ended up bringing her mother, and she had me come round and gave me a hug, and she was so nice to me, and I couldn't help just comparing how the 2 people reacted. I mean,
yeah, so this is an exclusive brethren lady you're talking about that was caring for your mum, supposedly,
yeah,
and she's literally told you.
BBH's cousin.
Yeah, so she's literally told you in a really bitter way. She's literally got you at the front door and told you in a really bitter way that,
exactly.
I hope you had a good look. That's just horrific.
Oh, it was just cruel. And I mean, there's so many examples of just cruelty. Like, it's not like they're trying to encourage you to seek your way back or something. Then 2 months later, she was hospitalised. But I feel it was God's grace that she ended up in a little country hospital, and I got to speak to her twice before she died. Because she was so far away, it was about 20 miles out of town, and the EBs, of course, used to visit and sit with her during the day. But the nurses were lovely and told me to ring at night when they'd gone to their meeting. Orange, there's so many EBs that everybody knows about them. And they told me that all she did was talk about me, and she showed them her 1 scrapbook. And I kept saying, didn't she have 2? And they said no. So that's why I knew they'd taken the second one off her. She died soon after, and I chose to go up. I got to see her in their house, in her coffin, and my husband at the time asked if he could pray. They agreed, but it must have floored them. I almost burst out laughing, which would have been most inappropriate. So he prayed with them there. We'll have a giggle about that one because we understand how they would be horrified. Think of praying. They then said we could go to the grave at 9:30 a.m. the next day. My aunt, who was out by then, said to go at 9 as they're sure to start without me. Sure enough, I got there at 9 and they'd brought the coffin on a truck with hay bales, which my mother would have hated. She was so prim and proper. It felt so disrespectful. Then I found out she wasn't being buried next to my father, even though she had brought the plot there. More questions.
Wow.
Short, and people were glaring at me and were asked to stand back. I stood near my father's grave. When they started to fill in the grave, I walked forward because I thought none of them were relatives, none of them. She had no relatives in the EBs.
Yeah.
I walked forward, and I think what got to me was that Hope had died. You always hope for that reunion, and all she had missed out on, and all for nothing. Of course, then they gave me a copy of her will. I got 60,000. She'd owned a house, and she also was on a good superannuation pension because she'd got 5/8 of what my father would have been getting that day. So it had been indexed, and because he worked for the government and he had such a good job. my kids got 5,000 each and weren't even named in the will. The new will had only been done after a stroke, so less than 2 months before she died, and in Bathurst rather than Orange. I did talk to a lawyer about contesting it. No lawyer in the town would touch me because they were so scared of being black banned by the EBs, and there's so many of them there. But one lawyer did send me to one that was already black banned because he'd been in a divorce settlement. And when I talked to him, he said, you probably would win. They would use it against you that you had no relationship for 30 years, even though that wasn't your choice. But he said they will make you appeal and appeal and appeal till there's nothing left. He said,
that's it. They bleed you dry.
He said, I advise you to take your 60,000 and go. And they let me go to the house to choose some things, but it was like straight after the funeral and I wasn't in very good state. So there was a couple of things later that I decided I wanted. I mean, obviously this couple that had looked after her and inherited everything else, and I'd heard that they'd almost gone bankrupt a couple of times. So, yeah, that would, and I knew that I really didn't have enough strength to go up against them, though one of my friends in Sydney did take them to court and got some. But even in the will, they have strange things like all these little allocations to all these people that have supposedly helped them. Like my friend in Sydney, I think someone got 25,000 for mowing her father's lawn, but they lived in Orange 4 hours away. Like, yes.
Yeah, as if that happened. Like, what a load of bunkum.
But it seemed like back then they tried to give it to all the single women that, never married, so they seemed to get a lot. But after I'd got home, there was something I really wanted, and it was her crystal dressing table set. So this was another thing that happened. And her mother had bought it for her after her father had died for her 21st birthday. So it always sat on her dressing table and I was never allowed to touch it in case it got chipped or broken. And it was extra special to her because she knew her mother had paid it off over 6 months and lay by it. So it was a big deal.
Yeah.
And so I asked, could I have it? Yeah, and they sent it to me in a big box, not even wrapped in a piece of newspaper. When it came back, there was nothing, none of it was, wasn't a piece in it that
wasn't broken.
A tiny bit.
Yeah.
It was more cruel than if they'd said no.
Yeah.
And the woman that sent it, who was the lady, she was older than me. Like, it wasn't like she didn't know to bubble wrap crystal or something, but it was in quite a big box.
Yeah,
and
they don't care.
A crystal tray. So to me it was like, and maybe she'd heard that I'd tried to contest the will, so maybe that was her way of getting back or something. I don't know. And then the other thing I asked for was the Alexander's hymn book, and she went, oh, no, she gave that to our daughter when she got married. Whereas I'd had the memory of Mum, and she used to play the piano every night. That was part of her thing with stress. She'd just play through the hymn books one after another. And so I always went to sleep listening to Mum playing. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't like it's even like I was cheated out of those memories.
Yeah.
I think that's probably most of what I've got to say, because I wanted to go.
And this was all during when Mr. Simonton was taking the lead, like he was the man of God at that point in time, right?
Well, I wasn't even in that long during Mr. Simonton's time.
But when your mum passed away, that was during Mr.
passed away in 2006, so BDH would have been in then.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Around that time.
Yeah.
So I left in 1973.
Oh, I see. So this is 2006. So yeah, BDH would have been in power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My mum was 89 when she died. So she was only in her 50s when I left. So all that time she was on her own and treated second rate because she was, well, not a widow for the truth, because she had a daughter who left. But they're always second rate women that are in the left that, have lost family. And but to find out 11 years after that, it was in 2017 that her piano tuner told my friend that she was packed up ready to leave to come down to me. It makes you think, because you never do beg them to leave, because that's what the EBs expect you to do. I think that's the thing. So if anything thing, I probably went the other way. I've always wanted people to make their own choices, and that's one of the reasons I left. I wanted my kids to make choices for themselves. So I've never wanted to push people out. And probably maybe I went too far the other way. Maybe, that if I rung my mum or kept in contact more, she probably would have come to me. And that's a really hard thing to live with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but even if you had, if they'd got wind of it, she would have been completely cut off anyway. So there's almost nothing you can do.
Oh, I know, and I've had to forgive myself for that. It's hard because I can't ask the questions.
Yeah.
I found that out 11 years after she died. So there's nobody to even ask, nobody that would tell me, unless it's somebody in Orange who leaves recently who knew. But even most of the young people that have left in Orange didn't even know me. Yeah. Because I've lived in Tasmania, I haven't lived there.
Yeah.
So, but that's basically the story. There's quite a bit there. And I know I did read some of it because I spent a long time putting it together. And it was, sometimes it's easier to read it or you get too teary. And I mean, it's still teary, even after all this time, some of those bits.
I can imagine. It's a very, very intense story. Like, you've been through a lot. There's a lot in there. And 3 generations of leaders as well. I mean, started with JT Jr., Symington, or 4 actually. John
Hales would have been around. And see, my mum quite liked John and Helen Hales because she grew up with them.
I think most did in that generation because he was a bit more believable as a humble Christian, principled man. Whereas, then it's just the next one's just unbelievable, just mind-boggling.
Yeah, go ahead. She was in the church for 10 years. So I don't know whether that was because she was ill or what the story was, but I would imagine that there were things that she just did not agree with because the values that she taught me, and Mum was the one that taught me a lot about the Bible, whereas Dad taught me good basic ways of how you live your life and how you care for people. And it's been interesting because I do family history. I've actually found, like, as I've looked at all these people that were Dad's cousins, I realised we used to visit them quite often. Like, he'd go to borrow some tool or some part, and he had another cousin who he actually used to use his equipment for when he did bees. And I actually think my dad had sort of had a foot in both camps. I remember going to his work and watching television. He didn't worry. And when my friends all made their debut when I was in grade 12, he took me down to watch from the stage. Mum ticked him off because she was scared someone would find out. So I actually think he probably would have left if he hadn't died. Like, I'm sure he would have supported me to go to university, just from what his brother said.
Well, it must have been terribly hard for those people that lived through the separation thing, because initially their lives they were quite able to do that, live in both camps, and it was a seamless sort of they could have to do with both seamlessly. But then separation really was brutal. It would have been extremely hard for those people to just completely cut off contact with people that they were family, they, had to do with every week, like you said. And for you as a 7, were you 7? I believe you said you were 7.
7 or 8, I think, looking back when it all came in.
It was brutal.
Can you imagine explaining that to a child, that you have all these friends, especially being an only child? That's what's heart-wrenching about it. Your only child. And then all of a sudden, your world is turned upside down.
Yeah. And I don't even know that my parents totally agreed with it. But you're too scared to go along with it.
Well, the price of disagreeing, as you say, was too much. Like, it was like, like giving up half your family. Like, you had, as you said, you got half of your family in, half of your family out. The price of disagreeing is that you're completely cut off from half your family. I mean, there was no win situation in your parents' life, because either way they were being broken from half of their family.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you is, like, going back to the narrative that they spun with your dad when he was first shut up or whatever they decided to call it. Did you get to have conversations with him when he was living in a separate room from you guys? Like, what did he believe on? Like, they just spun the narrative on that.
That was the first time he was shut up, and it's a bit hazy with me because I don't think it went on for that long, but I can remember him sleeping in my parents' bedroom, and Mum sleeping in a single bed in my room. But it is quite hazy because it was traumatic to a young kid, so it would have must have happened not that long after separation. So I would have still been quite young. Mm-hmm. So maybe it sort of happened on the back of, and I'm not even sure what he was kicked out for totally, because as I said, at that stage, maybe he even kept in contact with his family. It could have been something like that.
But again,
I know Mum made the point of sleeping in them, but nobody suggested she move out of the house.
Mm-hmm. But this is a prime example again of where they went right to that he was, with another woman, right? And I think that's one of the biggest things that we're seeing post 95 podcasts is the amount of narratives that come forward. And I think I'm just going to take this opportunity right now to just make sure that if you're an ex-member, an ex-PBCC member, we're all conversing. I think it's super important to make sure when you hear these narratives that you check yourself, right? Make sure that you're checking the facts, because 99.9% of the narratives that come out of there are false. And again, this is how many years ago where they were spinning narratives back then. It's just heart-wrenching to hear some of the narratives that come out of there and get spread around. Like, these are people that we're talking about. So the narratives usually have some sort of sexual connotation added to them. They are literally absolute, like, you're trying to wrap your head. If you're having a hard time wrapping your head around a narrative that you've been given, I guarantee you it's a peeved narrative. It's not the truth.
Their go-to is infidelity, though. Their real first slander is infidelity. If they don't want you to have to do with somebody on the outside, their first thing is to tell you that they cheated on their wife, or they were immoral in some way. And usually, it's so far from the truth that
yeah.
But even that story they told in front of everybody in an assembly meeting when I was 12. Like, at 12, you're not secure in your sexuality. Like, to hear something like that about your parents, it was
horrific.
So embarrassing. Like, I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me. And I've talked to my daughter, who's a trauma therapist, my middle daughter, and she said that's actually abuse, Mum.
Absolutely.
You actually say stuff like that in front of children. Like, it's just not on. And she's horrified that male priests actually interview young girls. Like, 100%, she said, that is just, there's so much that's so wrong.
And it's still happening. It's still happening. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she works with trauma every day. She's a trauma therapy specialist and now teaches it to childcare centres and teachers and leaders in group homes. And she said, I deal with PTSD, I deal with abuse. And she said, this is up there. She kept saying, Mum, you've got to do something about it. So my three girls have really pushed me to do this. And also my eldest grandchild, who has done a project on cults. So she's actually listened to some of the Get Alive podcasts. I was a bit worried that some might be a bit beyond her, but she said, I can handle it. But she's like really into social justice.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest thing for all of us out here. There is so much social injustice, and that's what motivates us and spurs us to take action and speak out. They say that we're bitter and that we're opposers, but the reality is that there is so much social injustice that you just feel like you cannot sit on your hands. You can't just keep sitting on your hands being quiet, because it's ongoing. If it was stopped, if it was in the past and it had stopped, then you would, you might think about, just maybe move on. But the fact that it continues and it's still present and still happening, that's what really, spurs us to do. You have to do something. You have to speak up. Like, these people just don't have a chance. And it's the next generation and the next generation.
Exactly. And I've got kids and grandkids. I feel even more strongly sometimes because I know how I would feel if some of this stuff was happening to my kids. And this is why I'm so glad I'm out, because I've stopped that. I've actually broken that curse over my family. And it really virtually is like a curse.
100%.
Some of this stuff.
How were you treated after you left? Like, once you left, like, how were you treated?
Well, no one saw me because we wouldn't tell them where we were. And because I was in a different state, no one really recognised me. I had a few funny stories, like I owned a scrapbook shop at one stage, and obviously they didn't know I was an ex-PEEB, and they often used to come in and buy scrapbooking supplies, and I used to have a little chuckle to myself. And my daughter, my youngest daughter, worked in there, and I'd go, Peeves. But they didn't recognise me. They used to when I went back to Orange. I can remember when I'd had my first child, being up there with my cousin, because in Orange everybody, as I said, knows everybody. There's more of them in Orange than there is in Hobart. But I remember there was these two young girls I think we were in the supermarket, and I only had one kid, so she was in the supermarket trolley, and they started going, there's the bastards, because that's what they used to call each other. That was a JT Junior thing. And I actually, my cousin went to yell back at them, and I went, no, don't join them. And I actually put my hands over my daughter's ears and said, would you mind not swearing in front of my daughter? She's not used to it. And they slunk off because it made them look idiots in the supermarket. Yeah. Because they were. They were really there's the bastards. And I actually spoke quietly, just like that, and went, and it was like I made them look fools. And that's always been how I've always wanted to deal with it.
Yeah.
But so I haven't probably had to deal with it as much as I know that my kids, see, they've got 4 aunts they've never met. Now, 2 of my kids are in their 40s and one's in their 30s. One of the aunts lives in Hobart. Only one of them met their grandfather who lived in Hobart. And I mean, as I said, most of that's my ex-husband's story. But he died on a Tuesday, was buried on a Wednesday, and we found out on the Friday through his brother. My church at that time did a service around a closed grave, which I think was good. I think people often have queried me because why did I go so far for my mother's funeral? But I felt I needed to do it for my own closure. Mm-hmm. And I think it was good that I did. I got to see her in the coffin. I got to say goodbye. But I think everybody's got to do what's right for them. But it's something that always sits in your peripheral, I think. I've never felt that being an XEB has taken over my life, and I've still had a good life. There's been some hard times. And I don't only hang with XEBs, definitely, but I've got some good XEB friends because some of them just understand stuff. And I think that's one of the things when my marriage broke up that I've often missed being able to talk to him about stuff. And I've sent him links to Get a Life podcasts, and I know he's a bit horrified and, even about the houses and stuff they've got because, as I said, he's got 4 sisters still in. I've been very careful not to talk about the family much because I know some of them still have contact with those in, and I don't want to get in the middle of that. And I know that, once you're an opposer, that's it. That shuts that door for you. So that's got to be their choice. And I've had people too in the XEB community who say, get over it. Just stop watching things like this, because I think I've watched every podcast. But I did have surgery last year and got stuck in a chair for 6 months. So
you're able to catch up.
I was able to catch up with lots, but I do tend to listen to them often when I'm doing something else. And I don't think I get bogged. Sometimes I get angry, and I'll often talk to my daughter about it. And she goes, I deal with enough trauma every day. I don't need more. She said, it just makes me so angry.
Yeah.
I do think she talked about people going to, like, even giving wine to babies. She said that's totally illegal. She said you can report them to child services.
They would deny it. The thing is, they're so prepared to lie.
Exactly.
As soon as they get pulled up.
or someone who's left who said they were made, and then they'd say we don't do that anymore, or I know
they just twist it. They just, yeah.
And, you made a good point there of like people who say, like, why don't we just get on with our lives? Why are we doing what we're doing? And I'm going to address that again because it is super important to me. When I think about the day that I die, when I die, I want to be absolutely sure I did everything that I could do to help free my family in there, because they do not know what they are in. They have no clue when you're that brainwashed and consumed by it. So to me, it is like a burning building. So to everybody out there that wants to understand why we do what we do, if you were to walk by a house that was burning, people inside it didn't know that it was burning, would you just walk by, or would you be rattling on every window and door to say, hey, get out? Does this consume my life? Yes, it does to a certain point, but I still live a very good, free life. I just gave myself 2 years to designate to this, to be able to do whatever we can do. And man, look at where we are, 95 podcasts in, and the amount of people leaving brings tears to my freaking face every time that I hear. I know that what we are doing is working.
It's breaking cycles.
You have to. This planet does not change until people start holding hands together and saying no to certain things. That includes the wine to the babies. Alcoholism is so rampant in there, and it starts very, very early. Our families are in there. Like when I have things that go wrong, that's all I want is to phone up my mom. I just want to phone up my mom, have someone to cry on. The person that gave birth to me is always the person that I want to go to. That I can't just put that in a box on a shelf. That's like human nature. I do not want to become them and shut everything down, pretend that it's behind me when it lives in me. When we don't deal with the trauma that lives in me, that ends up in cancer. That ends up in huge mental disorders, dementia, every other disease that you can think of. So for me to finally dive into the trauma that I endured and that you endured, Beverly. I mean, you've got a daughter that's a trauma therapist. I mean, we know that it's so important to talk. We have to talk. If you don't even do therapy, talk. Find someone close to you and start talking. That is what helps us process what we went through. Being involved in a cult that we were involved in, there is no way of putting it into a suitcase, putting it into a closet and forgetting about it. It'll catch up to you.
Yeah.
So this is twofold, right? One fold is healing for ourselves, but the other is to make sure that we are cutting down this tangled forest so that there is a path out of there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that people have choices, I think. None of us have ever wanted to make people leave, but we want them to make informed choices.
Yeah, and to know that they have a choice. And I said that on the last podcast with Steve. I said, like, for me, it's not about making them leave. It's not. It's about exposing and showing them what they're in so that all of a sudden in their head, they are thinking enough for themselves where all of a sudden they realize, I have a choice. And then all of a sudden they have 1 foot in and 1 foot out. And in that moment, they start making choices, whether to stay or whether to leave. But they need to make that choice that, yes, this is what I want to be in, or yes, this is what I want to be out, right? It's choice.
It's trying to get them to see the trees. At the moment, they can't see the trees from the forest. They're literally, they're in the forest and they can't even see the trees because it's just forest. But it's trying to make them take a step back and actually see the trees.
I think too, it must be so much harder now that the kids go to the EB school. They work in those sort of places. It must be so hard to have contacts on the outside that you can actually.
It's more indoctrination. It's heavier. Hard
I started asking one question, and once you ask one, then you start asking.
Floodgates opened. The floodgates open, and then you can't stop it. Yeah,
I do know that Ben Woodbury's TikToks are very active in the schools. So they do have ways and access to things somehow, because he's had teachers tell him that they talk about his TikToks. So,
right.
Right. So, and that's the whole point. I encourage every ex-member to get on TikTok. They're short videos. They're easy to access. It's different than a podcast. Anybody who's willing to stand up and do this, I could care less if there was like 50 podcast channels. We can use them all, right? Yeah. It's about getting everybody up, exposing this for what it is, to be able to give those inside the promise of a choice. That has always been my goal, right? Let them have choices.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And I feel quite strongly, I think, too, for females to have choices. I feel females, it's so much harder because a male tends to have the job. He's always, because of the way they treat women anyway in there, they always feel they need a male to live, which is why I think a lot of women stay in, because they're too scared to leave with the husband. But yes, it's really hard for women to be empowered in there, I think, especially. And I think if people are thinking about this, if you're thinking before you get married, get out so your girls have a chance.
Yeah. Next generation.
I am so glad I left when I did.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. That's what actually kept me strong, was whenever I had, you know, like in those early days where you're really sort of at sea, it was always, I always thought about my children, and it was what kept me strong, because I always swore that my kids would never have to deal with the things that I had to deal with.
Yeah.
And I mean, I didn't get to uni. I actually graduated with a diploma of family history in 2020. So I was
good on you.
Good for you.
Restoration. And my second husband was a uni graduate and very much encouraged me. I mean, I lost him in 2021, but was so glad he was there for my graduation. And he used to get so angry. He just didn't even know anything about the EBs. It was like he'd hear all this stuff and get quite angry about, So it's, you can just still do things. I mean, I look back and think maybe I should have gotten to uni early, but I guess I got married and we were building businesses, and that was sort of the norm. You supported your husband. So I wonder if, you know, part of that was my own EB upbringing. But my kids have had opportunities that I only dreamed of.
Yeah.
My daughter's got a double degree, and in between the 2 degrees, she did a year at Bible College in Sydney. They've had opportunities, and my youngest has a hairdressing salon which she runs, including 4 kids. She's done doing things that she wouldn't have been able to do in the EBs, and I'm so proud of where they've got. It's like they've taken that baton. It's like a relay race. They've taken that baton and run, and I see the grandkids are going to be doing the same. I've got 5 granddaughters, and
that's so beautiful.
3 grandsons, and the girls are like, I've got 3 teenagers, and they're running. So they have opportunities too. So it's the next generation that they never would have had if I'd stayed in.
Just seeing the potential fulfilled. Just seeing that potential fulfilled is just beautiful. Amazing. Yeah.
And I find it really hard. I was talking to one of my kids even the other day about, someone was saying that one of the one school global teachers had been let go because the young girl had got a period and she'd given him sex ed. And I know Ben was saying on his TikToks about no sex ed. And I'm really thankful that I did have sex ed in the EVs. I think maybe with my dad being a nurse as well. And I know his younger sister had got a period at 9 and didn't know what was going on. And he always remembered her running out and saying, I'm bleeding, I'm dying. And he always said, make sure she knows. And I could talk to my dad about it too. And Mum would say, it's a bit inappropriate. But he'd say, well, I've got female patients I deal with, you know. And he was always blasé about it. So I would.
Your dad sounds like such a wonderful man.
Oh, he was.
He but I can attest to that.
See him in my kids and grandkids now. And how caring they are. As I said, my middle daughter's worked in the community sector, and I know he would have been so proud of them. Of what they're doing, and he always was helping other people. He, fixed people's cars, and he'd do it just as to help them. And as I said, my mother's father also was the same. So I was brought up with these values which did not marry with the rules.
It's probably how you were able to say what you needed to say every time you saw something that didn't sit with you.
Oh, and I was mouthy, but I was a good debater, and my kids all are too. But see, my mum was in subject. Her mother was in subject. So I guess it's bound to come through. And I believe God creates strong women for a reason. Like, he didn't put women down in the Bible. I love Deborah, who was the judge that went to lead the army because her husband was too wussy. She's always been my one that I try and emulate. So I've kept my faith as I've left, but it's probably changed and evolved over time. I think I'm much more of a New Testament Christian. I feel the EBs are very Old Testament with their priests and all their rules and regulations.
And misogyny, Yeah,
and I believe Jesus died so we can approach God directly. I don't think anyone else has to say whether we're forgiven or not. It's up to between us and God. And my big thing is about loving your neighbour as yourself. And it's there's lots about not judging in the Bible, and I find that really hard, that they do point the finger at other people. As people say, if you point the finger at someone, you've got four fingers pointing back at yourself. And, look at yourself rather than look at other people and what they're doing, and look at what you can be doing to improve your lot and to help people and be kind.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I would love for the females in there to realize, of how judgmental the men are, right? Like,
not just the men though.
They both are, but I mean, the women just get caught up underneath it, because that's where all the fruit is falling off of the trees, is they're underneath it, right? But it's just, they're such a judgmental group. And I mean, I've had people talk to me about even just after leaving, saying that that's one thing that they're trying to, it's hard for them to lose that, right? It just follows you, that judgment, instead of being curious and open-minded and loving and compassionate. When for me, it's about listening to every single story, 100% heart open, as if that's me, right? When you do that, that's where the change starts happening. We should feel for each other. When we feel for each other, then we don't do the shit that's happening, right? Like, I guess part of me just, when I do have my deep cries, and I have a lot of cries. I have to cry it out because that's just who I am. That's my biggest question, is like, how can this group consider themselves Christians and not feel what every survivor has come forward and said, right? It breaks
their senses are completely dulled though. Honestly, the feelings are beaten out of them from such a young age that I don't think they really know how to feel. And that's something, that I've been working on myself in therapy, is like being able to express those feelings, because we were so just squashed from such a young age, where you feelings are just not important. And so I honestly just don't believe they do know how to feel. Their empathy is driven out of them. Their compassion is driven out of them. They don't even have that in them anymore. So, and then put on top of that the narrative to hate the world, and to their total disdain of anybody that's not part of the group.
So we had a list of books that weren't suitable for their schools, and one of the books that's banned is called Understanding Feelings.
Yeah, I'm not even surprised.
Oh, I love how my grandkids come out about feelings. Like, they're all into it. I feel this, and
right. That's how it's supposed to be.
One of them said, "I'm not having vaccinations. My body, my choice." And my daughter went, "I think I've overdone it." But she said, "I'm proud that she stands up and says that." I think she had a wheelie case when she was 5 and went to school with Nemo on it, and these kids were teasing her, and she went, "My case, my choice." And I'm thinking, EB kids wouldn't even be going to say stuff like that.
No.
And I love that they're speaking out, and doing that. They're really proud that I go and watch TikTok. fancy grandma being on TikTok. and I love the fact that I can sit down and chat to them about all this stuff individually, and I've got an open bond with them. And one of them actually said to her mum, Grandma's not judgmental at all. And I thought I was so proud of that, because I think I've worked hard on that. As you said, Cassie, it can be an automatic reaction.
Yeah. I see it all the time. Like I've even seen it in my own family members when I've met them, and it actually becomes quite shocking when you've been out for a while and then you see it again. It's like, oh, it's really quite in your face when you see the judgment.
The other thing I find really hard, and it was one story I hadn't actually told, but I remember back in the days when we were allowed mix with the non-EBs, I used to take all these kids to church. Dad would load them all in our car and they'd all borrow my hats when we had visiting evangelists. And so there'd be about 8 kids that I'm taking to church to hear an evangelist. All of a sudden, it's decreed you can't have anything to do with them. I would say all of those kids went really anti-religion. And I feel like a lot of that's in our court. Like, that definitely doesn't.
It's the opposite. It's the opposite of Christianity, isn't it?
Exactly. Like, and I think, how dare we think we're better than other people? We're not.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other thing that really gets to me about them, is how they set themselves up above people. There's so much. Jesus didn't like those sort of people. He said, I didn't come to save them. Those ones that stood on the street corner and said, thanks goodness I'm not like other men. Yeah. It's so pharisaical, He came and hung around with the prostitutes and probably the gays and everybody else.
Yeah.
The dregs of society like us.
Exactly.
People who actually turned their back on it. And that's the thing. I've always felt that, as I said, I've kept my faith, but my faith's changed a lot over the years, I think. And it's still evolving. I still look at things and think.
That's how we are. I think it should. I think our faith should evolve, right? Yeah.
I think we need to keep learning till we die too.
Exactly. Yeah.
I love to read, and I still love to research, and I've changed my mind about a lot of things. I know I smacked my kids. I wouldn't do that again. But it was my norm at that stage in my life. But I've learned so much about smacking only breeds fear, and I definitely didn't want to breed fear into my kids. And that I've watched my kids discipline their kids by, other means that's worked so much better. I mean, my kids and I can sit down and talk about that now, and that's good that we can. And I can say I was wrong, but I did the best I could at the time and with what I knew at the time.
I want to go back to your story a little bit, just because we just received something here the other day that I haven't made public yet, and you kind of set up the whole foundation for it, is going back to your parents' wills. On February 26th, so this is going to air later, but February 26th, there's the UBT Global Household webinar for 2024. And one of the things on the list is some guidance on wills, is what it's called. So after hearing Beverly's story and what she's went through with the will, I'm hoping that for those of you that are inside watching this can sit back, and whatever you're going to hear or whatever you heard on Monday, February 26th, is sit back and ask yourself, does this feel right to my gut? Does it feel right? Because I know a lot of people have been persuaded to give most of their finances back to something inside the PBCC. So I think one of the biggest things is the coercive control when it comes to the wills. And I mean, we know there's a lot of money that is flying around inside the PBCC, and they don't want it going to any ex-member outside. They don't want it going to places that it shouldn't go. But what I want you to do is, before you go and sign anything, I want you to try and sit with yourself and ask yourself, does this feel right?
Well, does it feel Christian? Is it in the Christian spirit? Yeah. That's probably more the question, because sometimes they feel like it's right because it's right according to the testimony, but if they really think about the Christian spirit and the Christian principles and then apply them, it may not be the same story.
And honestly, in a mainstream Christian church, just because you guys call yourself a mainstream Christian church, in a mainstream Christian church, like, the pastors aren't giving guidance on wills. Those wills aren't being asked to be brought back into their churches.
They've got no interest in people's individual.
Coercion.
Yeah,
it's coercion. It's complete
I know
coercion.
in my circumstances, my dad died without a will. So legally, after the 6 months, everything was half mine and half mum's.
Yeah.
So when my mum died, really half of it should have been mine to start with. And then maybe I should have got a percentage of hers. But because it had been over so many years, yes, there's definitely some things to look at. I was an only child and she had no relatives. So you would think that normally in the natural, you would inherit most of it.
Oh, no, they tie it up well before. If there's any sort of any chance that it might go to somebody that's on the outside, they tie it up very quickly.
My friend in Sydney, she said her father's signature didn't even look like his, and she was sure it was signed when he was maybe in a coma.
It would have been. I wouldn't even be surprised.
He held his hand and did it.
Yeah.
When he was unconscious. There's definitely some things that, tend to err on the side of totally illegal things.
Well, the thing is that they tell themselves that if it's for the protection or the betterment of their testimony, they'll literally justify anything, whether it's illegal or not. They are above the law at the end of the day because it's for the betterment of their testimony. So it's mind-boggling, absolutely mind-boggling.
We know how they get to people that are like close to death and how the sort of things they would say. I look at that with my mum's will being changed after a stroke and about 2 months before she died. I can imagine the stuff that they said to her that, she's not going to go to heaven unless she does this. And I would have loved to have seen the will before because they said we tried to get her to sell her house and she wouldn't. So to me, she always cared about me and she really wanted me to have stuff.
Yeah.
It's funny. Something else that's on the agenda for that webinar is an update on the OSG campus modernization project.
Oh, wow.
Right. So I just want to wrap this all up because we've had a lot of potent podcasts lately regarding finances and money. And we've heard from inside what Bruce Hales is really wrapping up to believe in all of this. And he knows his time is numbered in the sense of being able to hold a charity status. And they're going to be scrambling.
He's doing in my opinion, he's doing a final money grab because
absolutely.
He knows that his time is limited. And they're doing a final money grab, and unbeknownst to the poor members at the very bottom of the rung, it's all coming out of their pockets, all for the school funds, for the better education of their children, for the fighting fund, all this rubbish that they hail up to get the money out of their pockets, and they think they're giving to a good cause, and they have no idea how it's just being siphoned straight back up to the top. And whether by legal means or illegal means, it doesn't matter. It just goes directly to the top. And I feel that he's become increasingly desperate with his money grabbing because he knows that the time is limited. He can't keep on keeping on because people are getting more clued in to what he's actually at.
Yeah,
maybe that's why they're making such a grab for real estate because that's part of where he's putting all his money into that can't be touched.
But also, you'll probably find that all that real estate is in odd people's names,
and
it's not. Yeah, it's so that they can't get it back. They'll be buying all the real estate and putting it in all these different names, so that when it comes time and the government finally wakes up or somebody finally wakes up to the absolute illegal crap that's going on, they can't get it back because it's all gone into other people's names. So there's no avenue. There's no avenue to try and come back for it. It's like the companies in the UK that got the PPE contracts that were dodgy, and the PPE couldn't even be used. And then suddenly they wound up 2 years later. End of last year, they were suddenly just wound up. The company's just liquidated. Yeah. There's no recourse. There's no getting that back. They're very smart. Like, they're very smart.
Damien Hasty says how hard it is to find the companies and trusts within companies within companies within companies, as he's looked too. And I mean, he's spent a lot of time on that. I think it's brilliant that we've got someone like him who's
he's just incredible, isn't he? Yeah.
Yes.
So many people have come forward to help out, like so many people in behind the scenes. So I may take this opportunity to say thank you to everybody behind the scenes that helps me, helps Richard, helps everybody stay upright at this moment. And I truly appreciate that.
Well, it's all driven from you, Cheryl, and we really appreciate it.
Well, there was a handful. We've all got our hands held together. I think we all want the same goal. Beverly, what would you want to say? What message would you give to those inside right now that have one foot in and one foot out?
Get all your ducks in a row. Make sure you've got things in places where you can access them, be it your paperwork. Get some money in a place where others can't get to it and don't realise it's there. Maybe even get a storage unit and put stuff in it. Be prepared, because things can fall down in a big hurry. Before you start even talking to your family, because I know that's the scary thing, that if one starts asking questions, I think with Steve Simmons and, his wife chose to stay in, but try and have some things in place before maybe you even say anything. And also, if you're not married, don't get married until you decide whether you want to leave or not. If you are married and don't have kids until you decide, because then it makes it all that much worse and that much harder to leave. People that are young couples with kids and want to go while they're still, the kids are young, and you can take your whole family with you. That's probably the thing I'd say, is if you're having questions, don't leave it forever.
Yeah. Thank you. That was very well summarized. Yeah. Thank you so much, Beverly, for coming on. This was there was just so many ups and downs and ahs, and it's just, you're a beautiful storyteller. I know that many people will resonate with what you've all said. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Some of the funny bits in amongst the drama to keep it a bit balanced.
Yeah.
Well, it was perfect. It was very emotional to start with, but I think it was very it'll really hit home to some people.
And I don't, most of the time I'm fine about it all, because I have done my therapy, I have done my work, and I still feel sad I didn't realise how much impact it even had on my children, like when you've got a grandparent shutting a door in their face and the things that happened, or seeing their parents upset or things like that. I mean, as they said, it didn't affect them like it did us, but with both of us having been EBs and their grandparents in, I mean, we had no parents at our wedding. When I had my kids, I remember crying for my mum, and I'm sure others have gone through that sort of thing too, because it's only really when you become a mum you appreciate your mum.
Yeah.
And all I could do was write her a letter and hope she'd received it.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you
for everything. Okay. Thank you, Cassie, for joining us.
You're welcome.
Okay. Until next time, everyone, much love to everybody. Bye-bye. If you're in a high-demand religious group and need help, please go to oliveleaf.network. To share your story or be a guest on the show, email info.getalife@proton.me. Check out www.get-a-life.net for Get a Life merchandise, books, and ways to support or get support. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to Get a Life, and comment.